Growing up in a rural area meant life was pretty straightforward for me and my older brother, Jack. We were the kind of family that stuck together through thick and thin, a principle drilled into us by our parents from the get-go. Our home wasn't much to look at, a modest farmhouse with peeling paint and creaky floorboards, but it was filled with love and laughter, making it a sanctuary for both of us. Our dad was a man of few words, preferring to let his actions speak for him. He worked the fields from dawn till dusk, his hands as rough as the soil he tended to. Mom, on the other hand, was the heart of our home. Her laughter was infectious, and she had a way of making even the simplest meals taste like gourmet feasts. Jack was always the competitive one, always aiming to be first, whether it was reaching the dinner table or finishing chores. "Beat ya again, sis," he'd boast, a wide grin plastered on his face, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Only 'cause you cheat," I'd retort, my hands on my hips, trying to look annoyed but failing miserably. We'd bicker back and forth, but it was all in good fun. School was a mixed bag for us. I loved the learning, soaking up knowledge like a sponge, while Jack was more interested in anything that didn't involve sitting still for too long. It was during these formative years that I realized I wanted something different for myself. I loved our home, but I yearned to see what was beyond the fields and fences that made up our world. College was my ticket out, a chance to explore and grow. When the acceptance letter arrived, it was a moment of mixed emotions. Mom was over the moon, proud as could be, while Dad gave me one of his rare smiles, his eyes saying what his mouth couldn't. Jack, though, was harder to read. "You sure about this, Sarah?" he asked one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. His voice was gruff, the words heavy with unspoken concern. "Yeah, I am," I replied, my voice steady, but my heart racing. I need to see what's out there, you know?" Jack nodded, the silence stretching between us. "Just don't forget where you come from, alright? These fields, this house, it's part of who you are." "I won't, I promise," I assured him, the weight of his words settling on my shoulders. It was a promise I intended to keep, no matter how far I roamed. College was a blur of studies and newfound freedoms, a stark contrast to the life I had left behind. Upon graduation, the thought of returning to that simple, rural life was overshadowed by the opportunities that lay in the city. I took a job and settled into my grandmother's house, a cozy little place that felt like a piece of home in the midst of urban chaos. The Harrisons, an elderly couple with hearts as wide as the fields back home, lived beside my grandmother's house, which I now called my own. Their granddaughter, Lily, lived with them, a city girl through and through, her world seemingly a universe apart from mine. Jack and Lily's whirlwind romance caught us all off guard, especially me. I wanted to be happy for them, really, I did. But Lily and I, we mixed like oil and water from the get-go. One evening, during a family dinner I hosted at my grandmother's house, the tension reached a boiling point. I had spent hours preparing the meal, eager to bring a piece of home to the city. The table was set, the food laid out, a feast by any standard, or so I thought. "What is this?" Lily asked, eyeing the spread with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "It's dinner," I said, trying to keep the annoyance out of my voice. "Mom's recipes. Thought it'd be nice to have a taste of home." Jack dug in, praising the flavors, but Lily pushed her food around her plate, barely taking a bite. "It's quaint," she finally said, her tone implying anything but. I clenched my jaw, feeling my temper rise. "Quaint?" I echoed, my voice sharper than I intended. "It's home cooking. Real food, not some overpriced dish from a fancy restaurant." Jack shot me a look, a silent plea to keep the peace, but I was past caring. "What's wrong, Lily? Not to your taste?" Lily set her fork down, her lips a thin line. "I just prefer food with a more refined palate," she said, each word dripping with condescension. The meal ended in awkward silence, the unspoken words hanging heavy between us. It was clear Lily and I were from two different worlds, and neither of us was willing to bridge that gap. Life had a way of throwing curveballs, but nothing could have prepared me for the news that shattered the ordinary flow of my days. Mr. Harrison, Lily's grandfather, had been involved in a serious car accident. I remember standing in my kitchen when Jack called. The moment I heard his voice, thick with emotion, I knew something was terribly wrong. "Sarah, it's Mr. Harrison, he didn't make it," Jack said in a strangled voice. My heart sank, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. Mr. Harrison had been like a second grandfather to me, always there with a story or a joke, his eyes twinkling with mirth. "We need to be there for Mrs. Harrison. She's all alone now," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, I know. The funeral's tomorrow. Can you believe it?" "Just like that, he's gone," Jack replied, the pain in his voice mirroring my own. The day of the funeral was a blur, a procession of faces and condolences that seemed to blend together in a haze of grief. The Harrisons' home, usually a beacon of warmth and laughter, felt cold and empty, the air heavy with loss. Mrs. Harrison, the rock of her family, looked small and fragile, her eyes lost in sorrow. But what struck me was the undercurrent of conversation that had nothing to do with mourning or loss. "I heard he left everything to her," whispered one distant relative to another, not even bothering to lower their voice enough. "Yeah, but what's going to happen now? Who's going to take care of everything?" came the reply, laced with greed rather than concern. The audacity of such talk, at such a time, made my blood boil. Was there no respect for the man who had just passed? For the woman who had lost her partner of so many years? It was then that Lily found me, her expression one of irritation rather than sorrow. "Sarah, what are you even doing here? You're not family. Maybe it's time you left," she said, her words sharp and unwelcome. I looked at her, incredulous. "I'm here to support Mrs. Harrison, just like everyone else. Or at least, that's what I thought we were all here for," I shot back, my patience wearing thin. Lily scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Please, like you being here makes any difference. Just go home, Sarah." With a heavy heart, I decided to leave, not wanting to cause a scene. But as I walked away, the snippets of conversation about assets and inheritance continued to echo in my ears, a stark reminder of the greed that often lurked just beneath the surface of familial bonds. The day after the funeral, my phone rang, slicing through the silence of my home. The screen displayed Mrs. Harrison's number, and I answered immediately, my voice thick with concern. "Sarah, dear, could you come over? I need to talk to someone." Mrs. Harrison's voice trembled through the line, her usual strength buried under layers of grief and fatigue. "Of course, Mrs. Harrison. I'll be right there," I replied, my heart aching for the woman who had suddenly found herself alone in the world. Arriving at her doorstep, I was greeted by a sight that tugged at my heartstrings. Mrs. Harrison stood there, a shadow of her former self, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Without a word, she ushered me inside, into the living room where so many of our neighborhood's memories had been made. "Thank you for coming, Sarah. It seems you're one of the few who truly cares," she began, her voice laced with a sorrow that resonated deep within me. "It's what neighbors are for, Mrs. Harrison. How are you holding up?" I asked, though the question felt inadequate against the magnitude of her loss. She sighed, a long, weary exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "As well as can be expected, I suppose. But it's not just the loneliness, Sarah. It's everything else. The vulture circling, if you know what I mean." I nodded, understanding all too well the ugly side of human nature that tragedy often revealed. "I've heard some talk," I admitted, my tone grim. "People can be so cruel, greedy? Yes, they can. And they are." Mrs. Harrison cut in, her words sharp with a bitterness that surprised me. "But that's not why I asked you here." She paused, gathering her thoughts, and when she continued, her voice was steadier, imbued with a resolve that belied her frail appearance. "My husband left everything to me, Sarah. The house, the savings, everything. And now, everyone's got their eyes on what they think they're owed. I reached out, placing a comforting hand over hers. But you're right, Mrs. Harrison. He wanted you to have it. Yes, he did. And I intend to honor his wishes. But, Sarah, there's something else. She hesitated, her gaze locking with mine, a silent plea for understanding. I need someone I can trust, someone outside this madness. And I think that's you. Before I could respond, the sound of the front door slamming echoed through the house, and footsteps approached. Lily appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing as they landed on me. What are you doing here? She demanded, her tone as cold as ice. I was just checking on Mrs. Harrison, I replied, my patience wearing thin at her constant hostility. Lily scoffed, dismissing my words with a wave of her hand. Well, you've checked. Now leave. We have family matters to discuss. Mrs. Harrison stood up, her stature small, but her presence commanding. Lily, Sarah is here because I invited her. She's been more of a family to me lately than my own blood. The tension in the room was palpable, a standoff between the grieving widow and the entitled granddaughter-in-law. But before the situation could escalate further, I decided to take the high road. I'll go, Mrs. Harrison. But please, call me if you need anything at all, I said, offering her a reassuring smile. In the 6 months following the uncomfortable confrontation at Mrs. Harrison's, my life seemed to drift back into a semblance of normalcy, at least on the surface. The once frequent visits to Mrs. Harrison's home ceased almost entirely. Whenever I tried calling her, I was met with the cold, impersonal tone of a disconnected line. Jack and Lily, meanwhile, became distant figures, their lives seemingly moving on without a backward glance towards me. Jack even went as far as to tell me not to call him anymore, a request that stung more than I cared to admit. One evening, I saw Mrs. Harrison and Lily near my house. The sight of Mrs. Harrison shocked me. The vibrant, spirited woman I remembered had been replaced by someone much frilier, her face drawn and pale, her body seemingly weighed down by more than just age. Mrs. Harrison, what happened? Are you all right? I asked, my concern mounting at the sight of her. Lily, ever the gatekeeper, was quick to answer. We're making some repairs at the house. It's going to be dusty, and I don't want Grandma breathing all that in. Thought she could stay with you for a bit, she explained, her tone suggesting this was more of an imposition than a request. Despite the surprise, I didn't hesitate. Of course, she can stay here. For as long as she needs, I said, turning to Mrs. Harrison with a reassuring smile. Lily didn't waste any time. Almost immediately, she brought over a few small bags containing Mrs. Harrison's essentials. The repairs should only take a couple of months. I'll give you a call when it's all clear for her to come back, she said, her voice carrying a finality that suggested the topic was not open for discussion. The moment Mrs. Harrison crossed the threshold into my home, something shifted. It wasn't just a physical move from one place to another, it was as if she was stepping out of a shadow that had held her captive far too long. When she sat down, the dam broke, and her tears flowed freely, each one a testament to the silent struggles she'd endured. Wrapped in a hug, Mrs. Harrison's voice was muffled, but her words were clear enough to send a chill down my spine. I've been living like a prisoner, Sarah. Couldn't step outside without asking, like I'm some kind of hostage in my own home. Night after night, those parties, the noise. And there's no repairs, none. It's all a sham. Lily, she wants me gone. Hearing her speak, my heart sank. Mrs. Harrison, the woman who'd always greeted me with a smile, had been suffering in silence, tormented in what should have been her sanctuary. This is unbelievable, I found myself saying, anger simmering beneath my shock. We should call the cops, Mrs. Harrison. They need to know about this. But she shook her head, a determined glint in her weary eyes. No, dear. I've got a plan. A better one. But I need your help. Can you call my lawyer? Ask him to come here? Her request took me aback, but I nodded. Of course, I'll call him first thing. As promised, I reached out to her lawyer, a man Mrs. Harrison had trusted for years. When he arrived, I offered them privacy, stepping away as they delved into discussions I wasn't privy to. Their murmured conversation, though inaudible, was a clear sign of the wheels of justice beginning to turn. Months had passed since Mrs. Harrison moved into my home, and the so-called repairs on her house showed no signs of progress. The silence on Lily's end was deafening, and my patience was wearing thin. Mrs. Harrison, for all her gratitude for my shelter, carried a sadness in her eyes that spoke volumes of the situation's toll on her. One evening, as Mrs. Harrison and I sat in the living room, a rare moment of peace enveloping us, I decided it was time to address the elephant in the room. Mrs. Harrison, something's not right. There's been no word from Lily, and your house, it looks untouched. Are you sure there's really repairs going on? I asked, the concern evident in my voice. She sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of her worries. I've had my doubts, dear. But what can I do? I'm just an old lady, and they've made it clear I'm not welcome in my own home. Her words stirred something within me, a fierce determination I hadn't known I possessed. Well, I'm not just going to sit back and watch this happen. It's time we found out what's really going on, I declared, my resolve hardening. The following day, I made my way to Mrs. Harrison's house. The sight that greeted me was exactly as I had feared. The house was silent, no workers in sight, no signs of any ongoing repairs. Just as I was about to leave, Lily and Jack pulled up in their car. The look on Lily's face when she saw me was a mix of surprise and irritation. Sarah, what are you doing here? Spying on us now? Lily snapped, her tone accusatory. I'm not spying. I'm looking for answers. Mrs. Harrison deserves to know what's happening with her house. I shot back, my patience wearing thin. Jack, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke up. Look, Sarah, this doesn't concern you. Just leave it be. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Doesn't concern me? Mrs. Harrison is living with me because you two claimed her house needed repairs. But I don't see any repairs happening. Lily rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed. Well, plans change. We've decided to do the repairs later. Grandma can stay with you a bit longer. That's not your decision to make. It's her house, her life. You can't just uproot her because it's convenient for you, I retorted, anger boiling within me. Jack stepped forward, trying to play the mediator. Sarah, let's just calm down and talk about this. We don't want to make a scene. A scene? You're the ones making a scene of her life. I won't stand by and watch you treat Mrs. Harrison like this, I declared, standing my ground. The conversation went back and forth, but my mind was made up. Mrs. Harrison had been through enough, and it was time someone took a stand for her. The next day, my phone rang. The screen flashed Lily's name, and a knot formed in my stomach before I even answered. What she asked next sent shockwaves through me. Look, I need a favor. Big one. Confirm Grandma's lost it, mentally. Say she needs to be in a home. I'll make it worth your while, 10 grand. Lily's voice was all business, cold and calculating. I felt my blood boil. Are you out of your mind? You think I'd sell out Mrs. Harrison like that? For money? I was seething, barely containing my anger. Just think about it, okay? It's easy money, she pressed, clearly not understanding the gravity of her request. Think about it? No, you listen, and you listen good. This is sick, Lily. Don't you ever ask me to do something like this again. Ever. I snapped back, my words laced with disgust. I ended the call, my hands trembling with rage. How could she? How could anyone be so heartless? When I told Mrs. Harrison about the call, I expected anger, maybe shock. But she just nodded, her expression resigned. I'm not surprised, dear. It's been clear to me for a while now, they see me as nothing more than an inconvenience. an obstacle to their greed. Her calmness in the face of such betrayal was both heartbreaking and infuriating. "They don't deserve you, Mrs. Harrison." "Not a bit," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It's all right, Sarah. I've made my peace with it. In fact, I've already taken steps to ensure they can't harm me further," she revealed, a hint of defiance in her tone. "What do you mean?" I asked, curious despite the heaviness in my heart. "I've transferred everything, my house, my savings, all of it, to you. Left just enough for myself to cover a stay in a nice nursing home, one that I picked out. But after what Lily just tried to pull. Maybe I rushed that decision," she explained, her eyes searching mine for understanding. I was floored. "Mrs. Harrison, why me? You barely know me." "Because you showed me kindness when they showed me greed. You offered me a home when they tried to take mine away. You're my family now, Sarah, in every way that matters," she said, her voice steady and sincere. The weight of her words, of her trust, was overwhelming. "You don't have to go to any home, not if you don't want to. Stay here, with me. We'll figure this out together," I offered, more determined than ever to protect her. Mrs. Harrison smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I'd like that very much, dear. Thank you." The day Mrs. Harrison asked me to gather all her relatives at the lawyer's office, I knew we were on the cusp of a seismic shift. I sent out the invitations, including to my brother, Jack, and his wife, Lily, whose actions had precipitated this whole affair. As we entered the lawyer's office on the day, the air was thick with tension, the kind you could cut with a knife. Mrs. Harrison, frail but fierce in her determination, held on to my arm, drawing strength from my presence. Once everyone was seated, the lawyer began, but it was Mrs. Harrison who took control of the room. "I brought you all here to announce my decision," she started, her voice stronger than I'd heard in months. "Over the past few years, I've seen true colors shown, care withheld, and greed run rampant in this family." There was an audible shift in the room, discomfort and denial mingling in the charged atmosphere. "I have decided to disinherit my daughter, my son, and my grandchildren," she continued, each word deliberate, her gaze unwavering. "The only person who has shown me kindness and decency is Sarah. She's my heir." Jack and Lily's faces turned a shade of red I hadn't seen before, their outrage palpable. Murmurs of disbelief and anger bubbled up among the relatives, but Mrs. Harrison wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I demand financial compensation from Lily and Jack for the distress they've caused me and for them to vacate my house immediately," she added, the lawyer nodding in agreement beside her. "You can't do this to us. Your family." Lily shrieked, her voice shrill with desperation. "Family?" Mrs. Harrison echoed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "This is what family does? No. Sarah has shown me more compassion and respect than any of you." The lawyer, sensing the situation spiraling, stepped in. "If we cannot proceed civilly, I will not hesitate to call the authorities," he warned, his voice a calm in the storm. Well, we just left. After Mrs. Harrison and I had spent a year and a half as more than just neighbors, but as family, her health took a turn for the worse. It was a tough blow, watching her grow weaker, spending her final days in the hospital. I was there as often as I could manage, holding her hand, talking about everything and nothing, trying to offer comfort in the face of the inevitable. A week after one of those quiet visits, she passed away. I took it upon myself to arrange a proper send-off for her. Despite reaching out through the lawyer to all her relatives, the day of the funeral came and went without a single one of them showing up to pay their respects. On the day of the funeral, my phone rang. It was Lily, the voice on the other end sounding desperate and defeated. I don't know how to say this, but we're in a bad spot. Jack lost his job, and we're behind on everything. Can we live in the house? We've got nowhere else." Her request left me in a tight spot, emotions and memories clashing like thunder. "Lily, you know that was never my decision to make." Mrs. Harrison made her choices clear, and they were about more than just a roof over your head. It was about respect, love, something you all seem to forget. But we're family, she protested weakly, the argument sounding hollow even to her ears. Family? I echoed, the word bitter on my tongue. Family doesn't do what you did. She needed you, and you turned your back. You made your choice, Lily. Now, you have to live with it. Ending the call, I felt a mix of anger and sorrow. It wasn't just about the house or the money, it was about the values Mrs. Harrison stood for, the lessons she taught me about kindness, integrity, and standing up for what's right.
Another Friday night, another special dinner to celebrate Carter's homecoming. I sighed as I put the final touches on the table setting. Dean had asked me to prepare Carter's favorite meal to welcome him back from his first year of college. Despite my reservations, I wanted to make a good impression and start on the right foot. The front door opened and Carter strolled in nonchalantly. "Hey," he muttered with a slight nod before brushing past me into the living room. "Carter, you're home!" Dean greeted him warmly, pulling him into a hug. "How was the drive?" "Long," Carter shrugged, glancing around dismissively. "Smells like someone's been cooking up a storm." I forced a smile. "I made your favorite, pot roast with garlic mashed potatoes. Thought we could have a nice family dinner to celebrate you being back." Carter scoffed. "Seriously? I've been looking forward to freedom from this sort of thing all year." He flopped onto the couch and grabbed the TV remote. Dean frowned slightly. "Carter, your stepmom went to a lot of effort here. The least you could do is join us for dinner." "Like I said, I'm free now. No more obligatory family crap." Carter didn't even look up from flipping channels. Disappointment and humiliation washed over me, but I refused to cause a scene on Carter's first night back. "It's no problem, really. I'll just leave you two to catch up." I hurried to the kitchen, fighting back tears. So much for trying to build bridges with my stepson. After a year apart, I'd hoped Carter might meet me halfway, but his cold reception made it clear nothing had changed. As I scraped the ruined dinner into the trash, I wondered just how long I could keep playing happy family. Over the following weeks, cracks began to show in our familial facade. Whenever Dean was at work, Carter made sure to subtly undermine me at every turn. He'd leave messes around the house, claiming he'd forgotten whose job it was to clean up after him. Snide remarks about my cooking skills became routine, even though he'd once raved about my meals. One afternoon, Dean got home early to find me frantically searching the den. "What's going on?" he asked with concern. Before I could explain, Carter sauntered in with a smirk. "Sorry, forgot to mention. I saw Jenna rummaging through your office earlier. Seemed pretty suspicious." Dean turned to me, his expression a mix of confusion and disappointment. "Jenna? Were you going through my things?" "No, of course not," I protested, shooting Carter a glare. "I was just looking for my necklace. It's gone missing." Carter shrugged innocently. "Maybe you should be more careful with your stuff." An uneasy silence fell over the room. Dean rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Well, I'm sure it'll turn up. Just try to be a bit more organized, okay, honey?" My mouth hung open in disbelief as Carter slipped away, a triumphant grin plastered across his face. He knew exactly what he was doing, planting seeds of doubt to drive a wedge between Dean and me. The incidents continued, each one chipping away at my credibility bit by bit. A missing set of car keys somehow ended up in my purse. A kitchen knife disappeared only to reappear tucked under the couch cushions. No matter how much I denied any involvement, Carter's well-timed observations made me seem careless at best, deceitful at worst. Dean tried to stay impartial, but I could see the strain it put on him. As much as he wanted to trust his wife, his son's steady stream of accusations made him second-guess everything. The man I'd fallen in love with, kind, caring, always willing to hear me out, started to pull away imperceptibly. Some nights I'd lie awake, Carter's chuckle echoing in my mind as I replayed the latest incident. Tears stung my eyes at the realization that my stepson was slowly poisoning my relationship with Dean, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. At least not yet. Carter's vendetta against me only escalated as the summer trudged on. He became more brazen, ramping up the disrespect whenever Dean had to work late. I did my best to bite my tongue, not wanting to come across as the nagging stepmother constantly complaining about her stepson. One afternoon, Dean was out running errands when Carter barged into the living room trailing a thick plume of pungent smoke. "Carter, are you smoking in the house?" I coughed, waving the haze away. He blew a cloud of smoke in my direction defiantly. "So what if I am?" "You know the rules. No smoking inside, especially not your father's cigars." I gestured to the expensive Cuban cigar smoldering between his fingers. Carter sneered. "Dad's too busy working his ass off to enjoy them anyway. Might as well get some use out of the things." Anger burned in my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Put it out right now, or I'll tell your father myself." In response, Carter defiantly took another long drag, then strutted down the hallway, leaving an acrid trail in his wake. I spent the next hour trying to air out the house before Dean got home. A few days later, the campus dean called to notify us that Carter had been suspended for the upcoming semester due to conduct violations. Dean was beside himself, demanding an explanation from his son. Carter simply shrugged it off. "Bunch of bees charges, doesn't matter. I'll just take some time off and re-enroll later." While Dean ranted about wasted potential, I pulled Carter aside. "How could you jeopardize your education like that? Don't you care at all about your future?" He laughed coldly. "Save the self-righteous mom routine for someone who actually cares what you think." In that moment, I lost my temper, raising my voice for the first time. "You arrogant, ungrateful little—" "Everything okay over here?" Dean interrupted, clearly concerned by our heated exchange. I swallowed hard, my face flushed. It's fine," I lied through gritted teeth. Carter just smirked triumphantly. I realized then I had two choices: confront Carter and risk driving a wedge between Dean and his only child, or stay silent in hopes the brat would eventually grow up. I opted for the latter, at least for the time being. Carter's destructive behavior reached a climax a few weeks later when he decided to throw an unauthorized party at our house. Dean was out of town on business, leaving me to deal with the entitled brat. Around 10 p.m., cars began lining the street outside. Thumping bass shook the windows as groups of rowdy college kids streamed in carrying cases of beer. I stormed into the living room to find Carter in the midst of the chaos. "What is going on here?" I shouted over the music. "You can't just throw a party without asking." Carter laughed derisively. "Last I checked, I still live here. I'll do whatever I want." "Not under my roof." I reached for the stereo to shut off the ear-splitting music, but a drunk partygoer shoved me away. "Hey, back off, lady," he slurred. Hands trembling with rage, I dialed Dean's number. Voicemail. I left an urgent message pleading for him to come home and put an end to this madness. The party raged into the early morning hours. Beer cans and red Solo cups littered the floor. Someone had vomited on the new rug in the den. When I threatened to call the cops, Carter just laughed coldly. "Go ahead. I'd love to see you try to explain this one to Dad." By the time the last reveler finally stumbled out, dawn was breaking. I collapsed on the couch, utterly drained and dreading the inevitable fallout when Dean returned. Sure enough, he was blindsided the second he walked through the door. "What the hell happened here?" he roared upon seeing the trash state of our home. Carter was waiting with a wry grin. "Sorry, Dad. Tried to keep things under control, but Jenna's party got way out of hand. She must have invited half the neighborhood over." My jaw dropped at the outrageous lie. "That's not true at all. He threw this stupid—" Dean held up a hand, his eyes blazing with anger. "I don't want to hear any more excuses, Jenna. Just go clean up this mess while I figure out how to pay for the damages." As I fought back furious tears, picking up shards of broken glass and overturned furniture, I knew Carter had finally crossed a line. This was war, and I was done playing nice. In the days following the disastrous party, I reached my breaking point. Carter's snide comments and underhanded tactics had gone too far. It was time to fight fire with fire. While Dean was at work, I discreetly set up hidden cameras throughout the house, in the living room, kitchen, even Carter's bedroom. If he wanted to play dirty, I'd make sure to catch every crooked move on film. Carter must have sensed the shifting dynamic, because he started actively trying to get under my skin at every opportunity. Dirty dishes were left out with mocking notes like, "Thanks for cleaning up after me, stepmommy." He'd barge into rooms and fart obnoxiously before winking at me. Childish pranks, but clearly designed to provoke a reaction. The final straw came when I discovered my favorite potted plant had been unceremoniously dumped over, soil littering the carpet. As I knelt to scoop up the mess, Carter strutted by. "You really should be more careful," he tsked. "Wouldn't want Dad thinking you've let the place go." White-hot fury blazed within me, but I refused to take the bait this time. "You're right, Carter. I'll be sure to show your father just how careless I've been." His cocky grin faltered slightly at my uncharacteristic calm. For once, I wasn't playing the flustered victim. Over the next few weeks, I diligently cataloged Carter's escalating misbehavior via the hidden cameras. There were the obvious things: him smugly admitting to the plant incident, emptying my bathroom cabinets onto the floor, even rifling through my underwear drawer and pocketing a lacy pair of panties with a depraved cackle. But there were also more subtle slights captured. Him purposefully breaking a vase and staging the shards to frame me, or scuffing up the walls near my bedroom before telling Dean he saw me carelessly knocking into them with boxes. My rage simmered, but I remained outwardly unperturbed, quietly letting Carter dig himself deeper and deeper into a hole of his own making. Dean noticed the change and occasionally commented on how I seemed calmer about the whole situation. Little did he know, the cameras were rolling, documenting every piece of incriminating proof. At last, it was time to bring Carter's reprehensible behavior into the light. With the damning video evidence compiled, I began eagerly awaiting the right moment to utterly shatter his fake image of the innocent, put-upon son. A deliciously devious smile crossed my lips as I imagined the look of shock and horror on Carter's sneering face when I revealed just how thoroughly I'd outmaneuvered him. Revenge would be sweet. I decided to strike at our next family dinner, when Dean's parents, Bonnie and Roy, would also be present. As we gathered around the table, Carter was already working his magic, charming his grandparents with that fake smile he reserved for relatives. "College agrees with you, Carter," Bonnie remarked proudly, "so mature and responsible." Carter flashed me a sly look as he replied, "I sure have had to grow up fast, Graham, especially dealing with certain household situations." Dean's brow furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Before Carter could respond, I cleared my throat loudly. "Actually, I'm glad you all are here. There's something I need to address." I turned to my dumbfounded husband. "Dean, I've spent months trying my best to keep the peace, to not rock the boat with Carter's behavior." I shot Carter a pointed glare and he paled slightly. "But enough is enough. The disrespect, the deliberate cruelty and mind games, it stops tonight." My heart raced as I prepared to unveil my carefully assembled proof. Carter squirmed in his seat. "Listen, whatever she's about to say—" "Shut up," I snapped, a firm edge in my voice that hung in the air. Carter's eyes went wide, rendered speechless for once. Pulling out my phone, I queued up the first video clip and turned it towards Dean and his parents. It showed Carter gleefully vandalizing my plant, grinning wickedly at the camera. A collective gasp went around the table. That's not what it looks like," Carter sputtered weakly. But I was just getting started. One by one, I played the videos. Carter purposefully trying to get me in trouble with staged incidents, his crude violation of my privacy, even outright admitting to the party that had caused so much strife. With each new piece of evidence, my stepson's eyes darted around desperately until he was finally rendered mute, unable to talk his way out of this. Dean's face was pale, his expression one of utter disbelief and horror as he watched his only child's true nature be laid bare. Even Bonnie and Roy were dumbstruck by the events unfolding before them. When the finale video played, a montage of Carter's most vile verbal insults and threats directed at me, a deafening silence hung over the table. I looked each of them squarely in the eyes before finally meeting Carter's pathetic, trembling gaze. "So," I stated flatly. "Any other questions about my behavior?" The silence that followed was excruciating. Carter shifted uncomfortably, his mouth opening and closing like a gasping fish. Dean stared at his son, utterly shell-shocked, while Bonnie and Roy bore matching expressions of horrified disbelief. Finally, Dean found his voice, the words coming out in a trembling rasp. "Carter, what? How could you?" Carter licked his lips nervously and tried to force a chuckle. "Come on, Dad. You know how good I am with computers. That footage is obviously faked. Don't you dare try to lie anymore," I exploded, slamming my fist on the table, We've all seen the truth with our own eyes. Is it true, Carter? Bonnie's voice was tight with unshed tears. Did you really do those horrible things to Jenna? For a long moment, Carter avoided her piercing gaze. Then, almost inaudibly, he muttered, "So what if I did?" The smug defiance in his tone lit a fire in Dean's eyes. He shot up from his chair, the legs screeching against the floor. "That's enough. I will not have you disrespecting my wife any longer with your twisted games." Carter recoiled from the booming force of his father's voice. In all the years I'd known them, I'd never seen Dean raise his voice like that towards his son. The alpha male persona was chilling. "But, Dad, you have to listen." "No, you listen." Dean stabbed a finger towards Carter's face, his jaw clenching with barely restrained rage. "I don't know what I did to make you resent Jenna so much, to treat her so atrociously. But I can promise you, those days of disrespect under my roof are over." Carter opened his mouth to protest, but Dean barreled forward. "In fact, I think it's time you experience the real world without Mommy and Daddy's support. Starting tonight, you're going to find your own place to live and get a job to pay your bills. Maybe taking some personal responsibility will straighten you out." The spoiled brat's face twisted into an ugly snarl. "You're choosing her over your own flesh and blood? Some great father you are!" Almost instantly, Bonnie fixed Carter with a withering look. "Don't you dare speak to your father that way after what we just saw. He's right. It's long past time you faced some consequences for your actions." The certainty in her tone, mirrored by Roy's solemn nod, seemed to drain the last of Carter's bravado. He cast one final venomous glare at me before storming out of the dining room, footsteps pounding up the stairs. As the tension finally broke, I sagged back in my chair, suddenly feeling every ounce of the burden I'd been carrying for months. Dean pulled me into a tight embrace, his own eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry, Jenna," he whispered into my hair. "Sorry I didn't see the truth sooner, but I promise you, no more games, no more toxicity. It's time Carter faced reality." After all the anguish and anger, an immense sense of relief washed over me. Finally, no more torment, no more lies corrupting my marriage. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe again. In the aftermath of that explosive dinner, Carter wasted no time moving out of the house. Dean stood firm, refusing to enable his son's entitled behavior any longer. A tense silence lingered between them as Carter packed up his belongings. "You'll regret this," Carter spat viciously at me before storming out the door with his bags. "Just you wait." But his threats rang hollow now. Dean and I had already weathered the worst of Carter's tantrums. With the dark truth exposed, his hold over us was broken. The first few months apart were admittedly rough. Carter stubbornly tried to make it on his own, too proud to admit failure and ask for help. Dean received terse messages about dead-end jobs and dingy apartments. I could tell it pained him to watch his son struggle. Roy and Bonnie remained ambivalent, their loyalty torn between siding with their grandson and acknowledging the wake-up call he so clearly needed. Our weekly family dinners were strained affairs, with Carter conspicuously absent. Slowly but surely, however, Carter's defiant exterior began to crack as the challenges of self-reliance took their toll. He finally swallowed what was left of his pride and re-enrolled in community college, realizing the value of completing his degree. One night, Dean and I were curled up watching a movie when his phone buzzed. He frowned at the caller ID but answered tentatively. "Hello, Carter? What's—" I watched Dean's expression morph from concern to stunned disbelief as Carter's voice crackled through the line. After a long pause, the faintest hint of a smile played across his lips. When he finally ended the call, Dean turned to me with an almost giddy look. "Carter, he apologized. He says living alone has been humbling, made him realize how good he really had it." My own jaw dropped as Dean continued. He asked if he could come by soon to apologize in person and get a fresh start. Though part of me still harbored resentment over Carter's cruelty, I could only nod numbly and pull Dean into a fierce hug. In that moment, I allowed myself to feel a sliver of hope that our family could finally heal. True to his word, Carter sheepishly appeared on our doorstep a week later, his cockiness replaced by a haggard vulnerability. As he struggled to meet my gaze, I could see the arrogant, selfish boy had been replaced by someone rawer, more aware of life's difficulties. "Jenna," I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, he began haltingly. But I want you to know, from the bottom of my heart, how sorry I am for everything I put you through. The way I acted, it was inexcusable. Carter's eyes shone with the first hints of genuine remorse I'd ever witnessed. If you're willing, I'd like us to start over, to have a real relationship built on mutual understanding and respect. Because at the end of the day, he paused, choking up. You're the only mother I've got. In that moment, something deep inside me unlocked. The resentment, the fury, the urge to make him pay, it all melted away to be replaced by the faintest ember of empathy. Raising a hand to Carter's cheek, I simply nodded. Moving forward would be a long, arduous journey, but at last, I felt like we had a chance to forge the family I'd always dreamed of. One of love, trust, and shed of Carter's poisonous influence once and for all.